This is exciting for me on a couple of fronts. First of all, I titled this before you came in. I'm calling it Calm Meets Slow. And it's a kind of a direct play on how I interpret the work that you do and how I've come across your work through primarily LinkedIn, actually probably only LinkedIn, and your newsletter, Calm Tech, which is more than a newsletter. I think I first came across it as a newsletter, as some kind of publishing arm, but it's a lot more than that. And I'm excited to learn more about that as I get to know you. Because I started both a newsletter and then a corresponding podcast called Slow Tech. And it has to do mostly with like tech as a kind of somatic experience, like how we just relate to it, how we feel it, how we interpret, how we co-regulate or self-regulate with it. And in these last several months, as seemingly the kind of the world sort of unravels and starts to ravel and thread itself again into something, I guess, unrecognizable, I put all these things on hold because I realized I wasn't driven by a really clear vision. It was more just kind of feeling that suddenly when the feeling shifts, what does it become? And so that's where I am currently sitting with this. But I am, I just wanted to put that out there just to like air that out. Tell me about you and Calm Tech. How did you come to start Calm Tech?
I grew up in a home in Denver, Colorado, pretty isolated, um, with two parents that were broadcast engineers. So they put television on the air for a living when it was analog
Mm,
in the early 90s. And my environment was not entirely visual, it was mostly sound. So my mom had a big piano, which I would sit under and she would play. And my dad liked speakers, so he'd make speakers from scratch and play all sorts of music from around the world, but mostly from England. And then we watched a handful of shows total on television, which one we watched Star Trek The Next Generation starting in what, 1989? I think that's like
classic.
we watched Kung Fu The Legend Continues. I watched that with my mom.
Yellow carotene. Okay, cool.
A show called The Bold and the Beautiful, which was a soap opera about a lower class woman taking over a fashion empire, and it was a lot about mergers and acquisitions and board meetings. And then eventually we watched, James Bond and like some Cosmos and some Outer Limits and some Twilight Zone that we rented from Blockbuster Video. But that was about it. And I grew up in an immigrant neighborhood next to a very wealthy zip code, but we were not the wealthy zip code. We were the immigrants. And the funny thing was, I'm not an immigrant, but all of our neighbors were mostly. So it was, we had friends from Japan, we had friends from China. In school, my best friend was from Nigeria, and my mom's best friend was from Lebanon. And so the norm was go to people's houses in the neighborhood and ask, we brought you cheese. Why aren't you eating it? Or let's eat what you're eating. Or, ooh, uh, you have a rice cooker that sings. That's interesting. And then, of course we were going to these places where everyone got their food too. So it was my mom learns how to cook Japanese, I go to a Japanese dentist, we go to the Japanese food store at Sakura Square in Denver, and this was just the norm. And then in 1993, a couple of just sent over one person from Japan to my dad's work to learn broadcast engineering, and nobody would talk to him. But my dad was like, "Hi, how's it going? Let me take you out," and like let's talk about what it's like in Japan for broadcast engineering. And they became really good friends. That year for Christmas, we got a box from Japan that was full of VHS tapes from regular television and a bunch of candy, and we sent the same box over of American media and snacks to Japan, and it was our way of exchanging. So I saw all of this anime and all of these things way before they came out in the United States, and it was really a first understanding of what you might call cosmotechnics, that each culture has its own technology and that there's a kind of time delay that we're probably going to get this in 5 to 10 years. Heck yeah, I know all about the future of Power Rangers. Like it was like here's the
Yeah,
future, and here's
yeah.
populations and the need for automation and all of these things, and earthquakes and resiliency. So it was intense because there was a big earthquake at that time, and I was huge glossy magazines of this destruction. This was more about this felt more like my real world than the random kind of suburban neighborhood that I was growing up in Denver. And when I first went to preschool, I was very confused because there were all these people wearing shirts with different media on them. And I didn't have any of these references other than Star Trek. And so in Star Trek, it was people from different cultures all around the world showing up and dealing with problems together. And the interfaces were really good. The person that did the LCARS display on Star Trek is a user experience designer, and he was very clever. And they were all analog displays. They're printouts with dark black ink on them, have some color that shines through them. They're practical. And my dad also made a lot of stuff at the house. Lots and lots of things where LEDs, we would go to Radio Shack and he taught me how to solder. So I was soldering his synthesizers and all his experiments. The minute I had hand-eye coordination, this was the requirement. You memorize these resistor bands, hand me the resistor of the resistor band, please solder this together. This was the norm. And so very early on, he was making stuff at the house, like a light that would turn on when I needed to go to bed on a timer, or, we had this piano and it's a dry environment, so we need to basically water the piano by watering the humidifier. And the way the piano communicated that it needed water was this beautiful LED light. I don't actually know if it was LED. It was just this gorgeous orange light. It was like kind of one of those crystalline glass like diffusers on it. And so when it came on, it was as elegant as the piano. And I remember looking at that light, and it was my responsibility to water the piano, put new springs in the trampoline. I had all these random tasks around the house, maintenance tasks. So I learned about what's good to maintain, what's not good to maintain, what's a delightful notification like the Zerushi rice cooker that we had that sang, and what's a super annoying one like our old washer and dryer when they get done, and then everything that, you can have all these technology things, but then the sun going through the house is the most amazing thing of all. It's not about tech. And my dad gave me hand-me-downs for all of the experiments that he did that didn't work. So I had a voice-activated light when I was 9. We drilled through the walls to make ourselves a wireless internet before wireless was a thing. We were just hacking together everything that we could. And so it was very much like the childhood and the life of the person that coined the term calm technology, who was in New York. So I was very, very aware of technology. And even, my dad and I think one of the big things that we did is Sunday after breakfast or brunch or whatever, he would propose some weird thing to me and we'd sit at the table until we exhausted that issue. So it could be an ethical thing, it could be about voting, it could be about tech. I would get my allowance by him asking me how much a hard drive might cost in a half a year for this many, gigabytes. And if I got it, then I got the hard drive. So I got really good at predicting prices and understanding the kind of Moore's law of processors. And I think it was because my dad had me really young and he kind of wanted to continue either his childhood or his innovative spirit, even though he went into, telecom after broadcast engineering. And then I watched my parents' jobs get automated and when everything went digital, and that was really scary. So even though I wanted to become an engineer and a mathematician, and I was really good at math and science, my mom's best friend, who was a math professor, said, hey, maybe you should get a liberal arts degree just so you can think a little bit more about how things work in the world. And along the way, I was writing my thesis on the iPhone when it came out in 2007. It's one of the first researchers to research the iPhone and the screen and how it would change work, life, and play. I was made aware of this concept of calm technology from Xerox PARC, a person whose life I had missed. He died in 2004 at age 46, I think. I was writing my thesis in 2007. So it was this, wow, I just missed this person. And I remember reading his, primordial papers on calm tech, which had a couple little what would become principles, and then I expanded on it. But it was kind of like when I was 10 or 12 or whenever I ran into Plato on the shelves about philosophy. I thought Plato was the first person that I had read that just spoke plainly, and I thought he was a real guy that was alive at that point in time, born in 1958, because I thought the translator was actually Plato. Incorrect. And then here was another person who died who I couldn't meet, but he wrote in a way that I thought you could read these papers today or in 40 years or 40 years ago, and people are going to understand them. And I think that's the most important thing for me, is that everybody was thinking tech changes and tech is so squirrely. And I thought, no, tech doesn't change at all. We're still using things to do the exact same things we did before. We could have a broadcast studio and do this as well if we wanted to record this. We might store it on tape in the past, We might put it in an archive. Maybe this is actually more transient than, BBC, which has an archive, right? So, and it's like how much of a relationship do you have with that tool? You might need a bunch of years of training to be a broadcast engineer, but you might love your tools and have a real relationship with them because they're more physical. Whereas we're using Riverside, or we talked about using StreamYard, or we could use Google, whatever. Are we going to remember these platforms in 10 years? But, the condenser mic that you've gotten, or my little blue Nessie thing, or, maybe a microphone that my dad messed with at some point, I'll remember. Those are physical objects. They took longer to come up with, and they might last for a longer time. Like the little Braun calculator that I have here that like inspired the calculator on the phones. Yeah, I learned about Calm Tech, and it was something that made me cry because it was clear. And it's such a mess. There's so much noise right now. And I feel like people are really lost because we don't necessarily have tech apprenticeships. We don't have people studying the history of tools to make new tools. Most of tech is a way to make a return on an investment. There's an assumption that you have to make a company, that you must raise money to make a tech startup. And a lot of goals are to be publicly traded or bought by a social network. That's not to say that it's inherently bad. It's just it affects the way that we build things. And you don't have the physical interactions like I think it was John Warnock or Charles Jeske, whose dad was a physical printmaker and whose kid went on to make Adobe systems. Like there has to be some continuity. We can't just learn the digital shape and then think that I see kind of a bit of a depression that the dimensionality of our lives has gone down a little bit, where you go into a hotel room and it's like blank walls, and you try to use a remote control and it's smooth, and then the buttons have to make a sharp noise so you press them, and you focus more on the tool and not the task. And with Calm Tech, the whole point is to focus on the task and not the tool, and that it's a pass-through interface, like a pair of glasses where you focus on the view and not the glasses. And when they're made well, they work with you instead of against you, like a good pair of running shoes. So when we think about all of the tech in our lives that's fundamentally untuned, there's an opportunity to tune it. And because my dad was broadcast and audio engineer, it's all about signal processing, right? Like this is, let's tune this, let's adjust this signal. Your television signal is out of whack. Like let's adjust it so that it makes sense. And I think finally that people usually blame themselves instead of the tech. They say, I'm bad at tech. No, tech is bad at you. Tech is bad at us. Right now, what we think of as tech is something made from the West in the last 10 years. Tech is also a 1,000-year-old air conditioning unit developed in Persia using an underground river to keep things cool. That is also tech, and actually that's high tech. So I think the first thing when talking about Calm Tech is always expand the notion of what technology is far wider than some random thing that you see on the shelf in the corner of a Best Buy store.
That's such a great introduction to this story. Because as you were speaking, I thought about so many instances where needing to relate tangibly to something is so important. It's like part of my upbringing as well. You grew up in Denver, I grew up in LA. And I love how you mentioned the 1,000-year-old air conditioner utilizing a river, an underground river, in order to cool things down. I think of a 1,000-year-old teapot or a tea bowl as a piece of technology. And how there are plenty of modern day interpretations of, let's say, a teapot or something that would act like a teapot. And I had a really fascinating experience a year ago. I was doing so part of Slow Tech, part of what I bring to the field, to the industry, to the world, to people that I meet, is my now 15 plus year study and practice of Chinese tea culture. And so I do that in a like a team building or like a mindfulness oriented offering to organizations, to teams. One such team was at IDEO. So I went to IDEO's headquarters in San Francisco a year ago, and I had this incredible experience of having these timed tea ceremonies with different teams of, like, let's say 2 to 6 people throughout this day-long immersion, activation, engagement, whatever you want to call it. And where I set up and was seated, I was staring directly at the automatic matcha machine. And I just wish I spent more time just as an anthropologist, like learning about like why the fuck do you want to use an automatic washing machine when everything is right there? Like the tools are right there. Like when it comes to Chinese tea, yes, there probably are more pots and cups and decanters as other things that for the uninitiated might look and feel quite intimidating. I understand that. And perhaps with matcha, it's probably equally or more intimidating because there's really maybe two tools. There's the bowl, the chawan, and then the whisk, the bamboo whisk. It's probably at its most basic, if you're going to come at it at its most minimalist. But I was so fascinated to speak to the people who were coming to this automatic matcha machine. I don't remember the brand. It's some new fancy something in the last 2 years, some really hip thing, and that's the kind of the gong hit that hit for me as I was listening to your story, and how important it is to, as you say, to really widen the language, the scope of how people understand tech, what tech is, and the fact that it is sort of timeless. It's always, I mean, how we even got here, how we made it this far as a species. It's not because of the last 40 years of, tech innovation. It's because of the last, 40,000 years of tech innovation. What is it that you hope people will absorb, will learn, or will be able to experience by interfacing with what you present as calm tech?
I don't think I'm going to change anyone's mind.
Mm.
For instance, there's a whole group of people that think that AI should be in every fridge to tell you what you could make with the food in your fridge before it goes bad. And I use this as a joke in a lot of my speeches. And then I just got an email from a friend that said, I made that fridge. The whole point was not to have someone make that fridge. And if you read a lot of Mark Weiser, you actually get the AI in most cases is not really necessary. It's not that I don't use AI all day. I love it. But I use it for very specific things, and it's not integrated into my fridge. I have a choice on, hey, I've got this stuff. What could I make? And kind of use it to help me learn how to make something. And I'm doing that because I didn't come from a huge food family that we're going to go to Tuscany and together we're going to learn some 400-year-old recipe. I want that. People want the real thing. We can call it the revenge of the real, but people forgot that the real could exist and what it feels like because it's been removed by a couple generations. So I don't think I'm going to convince someone who's never experienced the real that the real is cool. If they're like 19 and they're like me as a 19-year-old that's like very engineering shaped, right? But there are people that say, well, the technology will solve the problem. But technology is also a tea ceremony. That's a really good calm technology, calming technology. And, Qigong, Tai Chi, self-regulating systems to get you to be present, meditation, and also, a good wooden staff that you can use to walk through the woods, a great broom that you can use to sweep the leaves, a really good window. So when people say the tech will solve it and they don't build in any social systems, it's strange, right? Because all of these systems that we have, whether it's a monetary system or a supermarket, involve networks of humans and how it is for them to provide that service again and again. It's like the life is being drained out of these things, And I was just in Japan. We're opening up a Kyoto version of the Calm Tech Institute so that we can work with 1,300 years of history and examples to help inspire people who build technology about how it could be. And we were trying to figure out how to work together, and we did a tea ceremony. The first time I did a tea ceremony, a proper one, was with one of the descendants of the people who invented the tea ceremony. So this was an amazing experience because we got to nerd out a lot on all of the different detail. And I was so amazed how, of course, you get trained to be very present and understand what people are doing in the room, and you're basically signal processing some of the noise out so that you have clearer signal at the end of that. And I think sometimes when people have fear or uncertainty, they can swap into that mode, and social media definitely triggers that. And then it's really hard to see the thing you want to do. Oftentimes, I always think, do you want to remember the things you want to do with your life? Take a 3-day road trip. Once you get out of the city and you're out of that familiar environment, you can kind of remember, this is the thing I want to do. That might take some time. But in a tea ceremony, it's almost like stop being in your head, think about the other person who's also been in their head. Now have an empathy for the other person. And we did, within this ceremony, we did a Chinese ceremony first, and then we did Japanese ceremony, which was great. At home, I'll have some pu'er tea, which is a great fermented tea. You can have it ferment for, 40 years? You can have a 40-year-old tea that's older than you by a bunch. And then
Next time you come here, I have a 1960. We should try together. I drink a lot of pour.
What I love about it is you might get, and this happens to me a lot, is it's really hard to get people to go through an idea without having like hypolinks instead of like hyperlinks, where it's just da-da-da-da-da. And with the puer, it was if you get it right, then you can think about one idea with the other person for fun for like 40 minutes. And afterwards, that non-fragmented time feels really nice. It's some of the silent meditations one of my friends introduced me to is you get a bunch of people at a conference, take all their name badges off, and you just walk around the street, don't say anything to each other. You don't have to have thoughts in your head or not, doesn't matter. Just be quiet and just look. And at the end, everybody feels like a kid again. Because for a kid, it's, whoa, look at that. Ooh, like jump up and touch the leaves. And like, look at all of the people. And also, we're in a strange neighborhood. Look at how much there is in this neighborhood. I didn't notice that before because I was in my phone or talking to somebody else, trying to get my point across, or trying to, talk about this person I had an adversarial situation with at work that I can't solve it because I don't have any understanding of like, nonviolent communication. I haven't taken the core, it's blah. But to actually be a kid, it's like, oh, look at that leaf. Cool. Yeah, leaf. There's something really nice about that. And I think there's another thing about distortion. So, and I'm not going to name names, but this happens all the time where you have somebody who's gone to Japan and they come back. They wear the robes and they make a very serious tea house where you need to practice all the decorum. And it's like a misunderstanding of a whole thing where it's like, no. You make someone feel very comfortable and you meditate and cool things happen and your brain is doing the work, but the host is not the person that you focus on. They might be someone that entertains you or is there, but they're facilitating a pass-through experience. Whereas some guy that went to Japan and picks up some ropes, I don't want to be focusing on him, and I don't want him to tell me so much detail about the tea. I want the tea to do the talking. I want the cups to do the talking. I want the ceremony to do the talking. I want the trees to do the talking. I want my brain to not have enough detail so it fills in detail. And these things are really hard to talk about because they're so nuanced, and we live in a very visual-based declarative culture. So talking about things as like a really good hammer extends your hand, but the people who build that hammer also have a culture of care, and care is a technology. It's just difficult because what it's redefining what technology is. Technology and two other ways to cut it that I think are really important is the tech fantasy that we write about when we make a technology magazine that's been outdated, that's still from the 90s and 60s, and then AI will take this and that and take our jobs. Okay, cool. And there will be flying cars, like Popular Mechanics magazine. And then there's stuff that looks good in movies. Blue screens, giant LEDs, stuff that makes sounds because it's got to be cinematic. That's also not tech. That's fantasy. Both of those are fantasies. Then there's who are the people that make the grid behind the scenes, electrical grid, and what that control room looks like. That's unseen technology that powers stuff. That's real tech. And then there's the what do you use in your everyday life? And what are the systems that make that, whether that's your car or a piece of paper or a printer or, your random book club, or you taking a walk with your friends. It's also technology. And so trying to differentiate is really important because we can get into these traps. When I was building a lot of circuit boards with my dad, we would go to the Radio Shack store where you get your LEDs, and the blue and green and yellow LEDs might be like 3 to 5 cents each. But the blue LEDs, when they came out, were $40 each. And I asked my dad, what the heck? Why are these so expensive? He said, well, it's a very, very high frequency, very expensive to produce, and at some point, someone will make that price cheaper, and we'll have a new kind of display called an RGB display, and we'll be able to have flat screens instead of, cathode ray tubes and these big bubbly television screens. And I said, whoa. And the person who did make it cheaper won the Nobel Prize. And blue, which, if you look at the history of painting and pigment, was often the color you'd paint the Virgin Mary, not because blue was a cool color, but the Virgin Mary would always get painted with a color that was the most expensive to procure at that time. Blue at one point was expensive. Same with purple and cochineal shells and all these things. Like there's a great book that I encourage everyone to read called, it's by Victoria Finlay. It's called Color Travels through a Paint Box, where she goes around the world and goes to all the places where color comes from for painting. And this was really important to me because I was looking at light being the equivalent of paint. And that in a way we're looking at these paintings made of light in these rectangles, and how that high frequency light, the color on these phones, is now more colorful and more decorated than the environments that we're in. Of course we want to escape into the phone. Of course we want the supernormal stimuli. And so, for me, I turn the saturation down on my phone so that it looks less exciting than the rest of the world. But what we saw with that cheaper blue LED is that we got colorful displays, whereas they could have been black and white. We could have had a world full of Kindles, a world of pads, tabs, and boards, as Mark Weiser said at Xerox PARC. But instead we got colorful displays, and in film, blue became the future of technology, the color that was expensive. And so blue LEDs made it everywhere, and they are melatonin inhibitors. They when you go to sleep, you start to get tired. It's melatonin. So they are interrupting your circadian rhythm and your sleep cycle. You walk into a room that has like a smart toilet and it's blue in the middle of the night, and it's hard to get back to sleep. So what do? Look at your phone, look through a bunch of stuff. 3 hours later, then you're mean to somebody at work, and then it has these cascading effects that are fundamentally invisible, difficult to track, and it's really hard to take that invisible and make it visible. But part of what I'm doing with Calm Tech Institute is to say, hey, let's look at how technology works with your primary attention. Like when you're driving a car, you're trying to keep your eyes on the road, and everything is there in your peripheral attention to give you information. More information, not less, is in calming because it helps you make a decision. That's kind of an inadvertent thing. We think calm, we think empty room with a yoga ball. No, it's actually a lot of information, like a forest, delivered in a way that you can kind of subscribe to by looking around and moving around. And then there's durability. How long does it last? That fancy automated matcha machine probably won't work when the company goes out of business, especially if it's a venture-backed company. And so not only do you have a bunch of e-waste, but you haven't taught people how to whisk the matcha in a really nice way to make it foamy and fluffy. And you're not actually treating the matcha with respect. Not to say that you should treat it with respect, but everything could be treated with respect. You're not seeing the production and behind the scenes. It's very expensive to produce matcha. It's very labor intensive, and there's now more matcha demand in the world because of automated matcha in Starbucks than there is supply. And you can't just, there's going to be a lot of fake matcha on the market pretty soon. And so durability is really important. And then light, is it having this super bright light, or is it a small orange indicator light that turns on only when something's wrong? Or in a car, you have an indicator light comes on when there's something wrong. And then sound, how does it sound? I'm sure that automated matcha machine doesn't sound very good.
I heard nothing too. I can't even do, I can never remember if it even made any sound.
So maybe it was designed really well to not make sound. That's great. And then there's materials. What is something made from? And how does it feel? And a lot of times here's a flat wall switch, but can you add dimensionality? Can you make it feel? And a lot of that is real materials have something. And there are all these terms for it in architecture and interior design, which I'm back learning as much as possible right now because people have really figured out there. But there's this kind of textural void that you can get into where your mind gets bored. And I assume that will make people want to drink more when you go into some Airbnb rental that is gray, devoid of texture and color. Every material is fake. And you can tell, and it's like, this is not a home. There's no care here. I'm in a shipping container for the soul. I have to drink to survive. And that's hard because it means that there's no time associated with it. It's how do you have a relationship with it? Are you really living? Are you really present? I really toying with the idea of writing a book or maybe just some sort of guide. I'm obviously a fan of Christopher Alexander's pattern language and a timeless way of building. It's really a lot about architecture. I have a book called Presence, where there's all the mental tools to be present, but can you put things in your environment like lime wash on the wall to allow for some texture? Also, it scrubs VOCs, volatile organic compounds, out of your environment, so that's really nice. Look at all these old building techniques. To not just say, let's put this on the wall because it looks cute, but to say, hey, if we did it with the original idea, how would we feel in this environment? And wouldn't this be a place that people would want to care for? And wouldn't this leave a memory? And wouldn't people act differently towards each other if they were in a space? A lot of times people say, let's get everyone at the table. I'm like, what table? Is it in a conference room with 2,000 ppm of CO2 so that people feel tired? Because a lot of times you get everyone in a room for like an 8-hour thing and the ventilation system can't handle it. And people start to feel tired. Whereas if you take people on a walk, you say, oh yeah, that's the thing that this actually counts as. Or you have a facilitator, you have like the human mind likes less than 45 minutes, unless you're listening to something on audio, which you are right now. And so it's a different way where I don't know who pushed everything into weird hourly chunks of time or, decided that we should have these sterile environments that might feel pretty good, like Herman Miller style, but and looking at that history, I mean, obviously, like we do know the answer to that. It's post World War II. Things, all this beautiful architecture got destroyed. We had all of this new glass and steel to rise out of the past, and then we had a bunch of artists moving into lofts in New York City because their parents bought them some place to live because they were trust fund kids, and then we got this loft aesthetic, and then that became this kind of romantic industrial situation, and now it's kind of like when you play a fractal over time. It gets really complicated and then it empties out and then it's like, okay, well, what's next? Well, we're going to have wainscoting again and wallpaper and but not maximalism, just something where when the mind goes into a space, you have what I call minimum viable texture, minimum viable, Marriott Bonvoy, for instance, totally has this figured out, even at their lower end parts of the chain. Every single thing has a slight texture on it in some way, and you're like, everything's okay. I'm on a business trip, but it's fine. The environment is caring for me. And it's that biophilia. We need to see that variety, that density, that outside, because that's where we came from. And we came from that not that long ago. It's the first time in history in which we have been inside for 80 or 90% of our day. And we're in environments that if you were to walk into it, in nature, it would be like a nuclear wasteland. So I think there's this dis-ease that we have that then causes us to say, I have to escape this non-place where I have no relation, identity, or history. Let me grab at this phone, which is also giving me a flat two-dimensional thing with ads that doesn't give me any relation, identity, or history either. And then we say, I'm really depressed. What am I going to do? And it used to be that you could just go to a shopping mall. You could live not great, but you don't have enough air conditioning. Just go to a mall. There's places, right? But now it's hard to find real nature, and it's not great, but it is nice. I mean, our needs are fulfilled. But is it life? Is it high resolution enough? Is it anything that we'll remember? And someone who grew up without a lot of aesthetics, it was, I need to understand color. I need to understand shape. I need to understand texture so that I don't just have a room with a mattress on the floor and a big light and I'm trying to automate a bunch of systems. That's why Americans want to go to Italy. They want the real, they want time, they want view, they want care. Where do you think that comes from? Really advanced technology in craft and community. And I think also in the West, we think that in order to pass something down, we need to write a research paper that a PhD can understand. Whereas you could teach a 5-year-old how to make noodles, and that's the equivalent of this crazy research paper. I love to watch these videos where a food scientist goes into the process of anybody making food, like hominy and all of these, ancient foods, and says, whoa, this is some chemistry here, but here's how it works. And to think how super smart people were in the past because they had to be. And to say that at the same time, hey, look at all this clever stuff. Yeah, I guess the final thing I'll say about this is a lawyer will study case history for hundreds of years, if not more. A doctor will study the history of medicine. Most industries, you're supposed to study some history if you're going to do something at the edge of it. or like a judge, how many years does it take to be a judge? But in tech, if you're an industrial designer, you study history. If you're a mechanical engineer, you study history. You have all sorts of math and things that you need to learn. But in software, you don't study any history. And so you end up with things that keep roving around the same system. And then eventually you get people who are like, ooh, I like the idea of Xerox PARC, but I'm not going to interview anybody who was actually there. We'll just make something that looks like a Xerox PARC, and they get just the 2 dimensions. So it's not to say that I have any of the answers, but I want to pick apart some of the questions of why do we see repeating tumorous products again and again that get a lot of investment, don't actually make a lot of investment for anybody, leave behind no legacy, and are kind of piles of trash, even though people are very well meaning. I'm not knocking the excitement of a Stanford grad who grew up without working in food service, who's never had to maintain anything. It's okay. They never had to experience that real. But to me, it's kind of a waste where it's like, and I was telling a company today, they want to make iPhone apps for this and that. I said, what if your, field agents who were doing the industrial work made the app? Well, what, right? Do they even need one? No, you're going to invest 15 to 20 million into this. You're going to have to compete with the industry to get what won't be the top iPhone developers because they're at Facebook. You're going to have to deploy something to Android, which isn't going to give you full coverage of people's phones because it's not possible. There's too many Androids. And you're going to have something that people can't use in the winter with their gloves. And so that's really hard. It's that people don't really think through. And I'm not sure exactly how to get to people, but I think with Calm Tech, there are a bunch of people that know that something's wrong, but that's okay because they'll find Calm Tech eventually, and they can do with it what they will. It's not a prescription. There's some principles. Then if you follow the Calm Tech certified standard, then you get Calm Tech approval stamped on your product, and then it's more about rewarding people who are taking the risk to do something that is non-standard right now. It used to be the norm to make a multi-generational family company that makes a physical product. It used to be the norm to make stuff with real materials because plastics weren't invented. It used to be the thing to do a lot of mathematics and make Moorish tiles, Moroccan interiors. And that was a legacy you could continue for 1,000 years. So now, where are the apprenticeships? Are there white collar apprenticeships? And then then at luxury, I guess, you might read like a Kinfolk magazine or something, but there's just not that many of that. You might have someone who has enough of a family fund that they can say, I'm going to spend the next 20 years figuring out how to dye stuff with yams in the backyard of land that I inherited that is beautiful, and invite a couple of people to come in and see this. And that's where the stuff is getting carried on. And a couple of other communities of craft. And I'm hoping that there's more of that because that was the norm. But again, once people get to have enough money, they buy the real thing. They go to Italy and get the cast of their foot made and have Italian leather. They want the craft. They want the handmade. So it becomes this issue where, we could look back to the Bauhaus movement where it's like, hey, we could have these things that people can buy and it's okay. But I also think we need a really strong, healthy middle class, that this can't just go luxury and that's it. Anybody should be able to understand like what a color reflection index is on a light, and why when you go into a dressing room and you look terrible, part of that is because you're using a light that has low CRI, so it's not reflecting the reds in your skin, so you look washed out like a zombie. And that in a beautiful high-end store or jewelry store, you're going to have specifically designed light that has a high CRI that looks like daylight, so everything looks really pretty, but then you take it out to your house with bad LEDs with a CRI of 80, and you're like, oh, this doesn't look as good as it did in the store. Like, just having some more information about that and saying, okay, maybe I'll spend a little bit more on these light bulbs, which are becoming more affordable. Just changing the sound or the light in an environment can change
Everything.
everything.
I don't know what to follow up with that. I have a premonition that you probably will be writing something soon. I don't know how soon, but I think as you just kind of touched on it for a brief second. That's important. It would be really useful, at least useful to to folks like me, and I'm sure other people who will find their way to Calm Tech, just like I found my way to tea. when I was 24, 25 years old. What are some recent products that you've, as Calmtech Institute, have recently stamped and like have a, put a certification stamp on? Because I also recall in the last few weeks there's this interesting unfolding conversation happening on a post you shared on LinkedIn about looking for a particular mobile device. So I guess those are kind of like, that's a forked question. What are some products that Calmtech Institute has recently certified?
Yeah, so one of my favorite ones is the unplug tag. So it's
I have
UNPL.
one. It's a great tag, yeah.
Yeah. So Carolyn Caldwell has made a pretty great tag, and what I like about it is that it fits on a keychain. It's bright yellow and it's small, so it's really easy. And when you can set up your phone so that when you tap the physical tag to it, it unlocks your social media for like 5 minutes. And there's an emergency mode which you can activate once per day that gives you 5 minutes access. But it's really, really lovely because it makes use of a physical piece of technology that you can move around. And so I'll bring mine with me on trips if I need to unlock, but it's reduced my screen time by so much. And I had to certify that because it was really well designed. There's another competitor on the market, but it's 3D printed, it's gray, it's larger, it doesn't have the same keychain ability, that the surface is not pleasant. It's a little bit forcible in how they do their marketing. I don't think that really aligns with the concepts of calm tech. And I can't see carrying around this like gray thing with me. But the unplug is really nice.
I know what you're speaking to. I feel like when I see it advertised, that particular product is like stuck on the refrigerator, so you have to walk over to the fridge. And
And it can be delightful and beautiful. So the unplug tag, at least it's a bright yellow so that you can be like, oh, I know where it is, but it feels like kind of like a weird esoteric charm sometimes. Like there's like a little bit of a spirit in it. And I love that. And I really do like the founder. Part of certifying a company is also meeting the company and saying like, what's your ethos? How long do you anticipate this to last? Do you have venture capital that's going to force you into shouting this instead of making a long-term sustainable company that can last for a long time. And I think that's really, really important. There's also Time Timer, which is a great name. It's a little clock where you turn the dial with your hand and there's a color disc that decreases based on how much time there is left, and it is fantastic. Because as a kid, you don't need to know how to tell time, but you can still tell what's left. And it's just helpful for being more aware of time. The beep on it is kind of an old-fashioned alarm clock beep, but you can turn it off. And they have an eco line of like really interesting textures and materials that you can put around it, and it's really good. And I really like their ethos as well. They've been around for a really long time, and they've been beloved by teachers and people with different attention differences, but they're really good. I met the Remarkable team who invited me out to do a workshop, and then I saw their Remarkable 3 tablet, and it matched. It really met the certification standard. And that one's a hard one. People love the Remarkable tablet. And they love it so much that they're like angry about it. Why doesn't it do this and this and this? And so that was a really hard one to certify because it was okay on paper. It meets all of these goals, and the company itself is set up in a way that it makes money and can grow sustainably and can make quite good products. But as with any company, you have to deal with the fact that it's 550 people instead of like 500,000 people, and how does that affect what they can put out? Be patient. This is an alternate future. If you either have like an iPad and a piece of paper, there's something in between. It's important for design, it's important for culture, it's important for history to have stuff that's in the in-betweens. A softer point on that gradient is really good, kind of like a wetland can help with trauma to a landscape. I like that one. I'm making a list today where I'm going to make a catalog for contractors that want to do calm tech in their buildings to just say, here are my favorite companies. There's a company called Waveform Lighting, and they're doing LED light that actually has a larger color spectrum so that it feels good to be around in your house. And also a lot of LED lighting has flicker in it, which is called pulse width modulation, where you turn it on and off really fast. And it's just not cozy light. And so there's a thing called constant circuit reduction, or just flicker free, where you can have these wonderful glowing orbs at 1700 Kelvin, like a nice warm light temperature in your room, and you can sleep next to them because they've edited out the blue spectrum that causes you not to sleep that's available in LED lights. So there's one company that I found that's doing that, and another company that makes like physical light switches that have like infinite dimming, and they make everything out of solid materials, and they're, and metal, and like, it's a very crafted, handmade type thing. But there's also enough of them that, you can buy them. And so I think, these might go into hotels for a while to say, if you're going to a hotel to put your sword, like, what are the invisible things you can put into a hotel until you get these things affordable enough by scale to put them in homes? And how do you make people aware of them? Whether that's a air purifier system or an air exchange system or any of these things, like texture on the walls, all of it comes together in like a miniature home environment, which is a hotel, or you could have it at your house. But I think there's so much opportunity to do that in like urban planning and shopping malls, not necessarily shopping malls, but you do it at an airport where you have both shopping and an airport. And airports are pretty good at it. There's a huge amount of air volume, so you're going to feel more awake inside. But there's a lot of, I hate to use the word opportunity. There's so much opportunity but there is a missing void that we can fill back in, where I want people to go into a space and feel like, oh, refreshed. They're like, oh, this is how it could be. But they don't know exactly what part of it is making them feel that way. Because again, you shouldn't notice all of the individual elements unless you look close. Like in a forest, you should just notice, I'm outside. And I think that's, if Calm Tech is successful, it just fades into the world, and nobody needs to remember that it existed before. My job is done.
Those are some good products. That sound good.
A bike,
A bike? A bike, yeah. A bike is a good Comtech product.
a good chair, a Yeti cooler.
A Yeti
That
cooler,
was
right?
very well designed.
Hmm.
Yeah, some of those scooters are actually pretty great that you can scoot around on. I see a lot of people using those. A color fill filter, so it's purple or pink, and when you need to change the filter, you just look, and if it's lost all of its color and turned yellow, then you swap it out using the principle of banana.
Right.
Now, Calm Tech in terms of paper, A0 to A4 paper sizes, they're built with visual harmony. I don't know where we got this 8.5 by 11 thing. Doesn't make sense. But someone made water bottles in that shape. So you can have an A4 water bottle that fits in your backpack. So like your backpack is sold based on like the A4 shape or whatever, and then the bottle of water is like a notebook, like a little bit thicker than a notebook, and you can put it in your backpack. And it's like a book. It's amazing.
Wow.
Just I really love inventions like that where like that. A good sunscreen is a Calm Tech, but it's really hard to find good sunscreen. And there's a standard spot called EWG Skin Deep, and they figure out what's in your sunscreen, and that's great. But lamps, light switches, rugs. A Persian rug is an extraordinarily good Calm Tech. It has history, time, texture, density, quiets a place, brings a place together, and it's beautiful, and every rug tells a story. So those things are things that I think about right alongside, the latest. I guess, for coffee, it's like a Chemex, an AeroPress. These are great. Making a pour over is pretty fun. That
I could think of certain kettles that I guess would attribute Comtech principles, like the gooseneck kettles with that slow pour, that
mm-hmm.
or really precision pour as well.
Yeah, or companies that there's a great book, oh, it's underneath my laptop, called Soft Electronics, and it's all about the history of like electronics in the 70s and 80s, all those little, be like a blender, but it's pretty, and it has physically articulated buttons, and it sits on top of your kitchen counter. And people still use these. So that part of me wants to retroactively certify a bunch of stuff that doesn't exist anymore just to give people ideas. Because, making
It's the
retro tech,
archive.
it's an archive, but yeah, and that's the thing that we need, right? If you look at, I think the people who invented Figma or SuperHigh, which is like a program that helps you learn Figma, everybody talks about this particular class at Brown University about design, and there's this person that teaches you the history of design, and then with your understanding you can make anything. and it's like, okay, there needs to be a product archive that we can go back to understand tools so that we can say, aha, could make something like this. And you do have industrial designers and industrial design students, and like, it needs to be perfect. And it's like, no, it needs to be reproducible as well, and easy to unbox, easy to put together. Floyd Bedframe does a really good job of this. And then, Warby Parker does a really good job of this. There's a couple of these out there that are special. But the really special ones we forget because we use them all day. Where did they go? I forgot. Oh, it's a foot pedal on a trash can. Right, that's the Calm Tech. The ones that don't make a big slam when you take your foot off the pedal. That's great.
Totally.
Those little drawers that like slowly close when you like
Yeah,
anything where there's like gradient softening, So there's amazing amounts, Um, Definitely not a leaf blower. Our neighborhood has to be quiet after 10 p.m., but at 6 in the morning, we're going to put leaf blowers everywhere. What, excuse me? What are you doing? We cannot have a rock band on the side of the street. Well, if you don't have a rock band in a garage, then you're not going to have the next Apple computer. Where do you
totally.
think these things come from?
What do you think they got exactly? No, that's yeah, exactly. You look at the history, you look at the early days of Apple. It's basically rock. It's basically dudes in a garage. I almost feel like I have these, not these I just use instead of wired headphones for this purpose. But about 20 years ago, I spent maybe 9 or 12 months in a contemporary music school for guitar here in LA, and I met an audiologist, and I got these custom mold fitted earplugs. That's my one of my every like hands down one of the ultimate Calm Tech products in my book for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And the next best thing is taking a paper towel, getting it wet, putting it in your ear because it'll shave to your
Totally.
ear.
Totally.
Right? Like low
Totally.
tech, high tech.
Low tech, yeah.
Yeah,
Low
they
tech
both give
calm
us
and high
about
tech.
30 decibels. Yeah.
Totally. Totally. What are you looking forward to, now that we have a new year starting in the next few couple of weeks? What are you looking what is Calm Tech, looking forward to in this coming year?
Making the Calm Tech Institute something that people can rely on for information, education, and a breath of fresh air around what they think tech is, as a very, not a quiet voice, kind of loud, but something that people can discover ideally by, LinkedIn or word of mouth to say, hey, you might want to look at this. This might be interesting to you. Ideally as an inspiration, or if a large company says, hey, we need to make a new set of hotels and we want to make it so it doesn't feel like a shipping container for the soul. Hey, can you come in and do some recommendations, which I'm very happy to do. And just really learning the neuroscience over the next year or two or three about how we perceive the world and how the materials in it, along attention, periphery, durability, light, sound, and material, affect how we experience the world and how to tune those. And not tune them in super expensive ways. Tune them in ways that anybody can do, whether they have a cheap rental as a college student or a very fancy place that has all the fanciest stuff, but somehow doesn't feel very good with the floor to ceiling windows. By the way, floor to ceiling windows can be unsettling. They feel a little bit like a door.
I can think of a few in my head right now.
Yeah. Why does it look good in a photo but doesn't feel good in real life? Ha! So just cover up about 30 inches of those on the bottom, something really nice, and then suddenly you can have a little hutch to read in and it feels nice. It's just, it's these little things, right? These little dial things a little bit different. We're just putting dials on the world with Calm Tech. Blue, let's just dial that to orange for the light. Is it this really loud blender? Well, let's just put a container over it. Now it's quieter. Put a rubber base on it. Yay! Sound abatement. Material? Well, you took this really weird laminate made out of plastic that is really gross. Well, you could put a different material. Put a little bit of texture on it. Use a real material. Variety in your product line. Have it be modular so people can choose which one they want. Just like the brass fittings on doors in a cabinet. Peripheral attention. Hey, it could say something without having to speak. Here's an icon. Now you know the status. Hooray! It's the little things. They don't cost too much, but they dramatically improve the product experience. You have physical buttons, but they all are smooth. Put a little texture on them. Put a little braille on them so you know which one is which. So I can continue to have a conversation with you while I'm using something else like a blender because I know where the on-off button is. Especially if, you're at a hotel room and it's dark and you're like, which is the light? Make it easier for people by using other senses. Your fingers are very high resolution. Really,
Right.
really high resolution. Engage the periphery. There's so much cool stuff that you can do that we forgot. One of my favorite is like on an old radio, like the little handheld one, there's a volume button where it like clicks so you know it's on, and then it has ridges and it's like a thin thing. That feels really nice. It's not too hard to make that. If you could make it in the 80s, you could make it now. Those components are still out there. There's probably even a bulk product junkyard of those. It's like, oh well, we need to make these. And it makes it possible for the next generation of Richard Feynman physicists. How did he get his start fixing radios? How are kids going to get their start doing mechanical stuff and making the next generation of products if they can't take them apart? There's a lot to be done.
Does Calmtech do so? You mentioned this space in Kyoto in Japan as a extension of the institute, or like as a physical manifestation of the institute. Are there other physical manifestations here in the States, or are there like events or workshops or sort of conferences or retreats?
Yeah, I've been doing through Future Spaces and through the World Experience Organization a bunch of like play labs and campfires and remote talks. And those are really fun. And then it's easier to get people virtually for those. And then I speak all over the world, depending on, who wants to have me. But usually if a company says, we want a 3-hour workshop, then it's really fun to be able to actually deep dive and go around and have people apply what they learned. In terms of, what we'll be doing with Calm Tech Institute, it's always better to partner with people that already have an audience because getting a lot of people at a time would be really nice and slowly having word of mouth. So I'm in New York, and while I don't think you could visit the office because I'm out of town a lot, it's totally possible to meet. It's just uh, those things, it's people will say, "Hey, I'm really interested," and we can talk. And it's a organic. So I don't want to book out a huge venue and be like, "Come learn about Calm Tech," because it's better just to read papers and like see a talk somewhere and then that sort of thing.
Awesome. I
There'll
want to
be more
follow
though.
up this. There'll be more, exactly. And I want to follow this conversation up with like just in a way like seeking your counsel on maybe working with WXO to like bring tea or tea experiences to these as you say these campfire type experiences because I'm looking forward into the next year like I do these one-offs and sort of relationship building here in LA in terms of offering it as a service. So I get curious about whether that could be partnered with someone, partnered with an organization, maybe partnered with Comtech, or instead of just being this kind of service of one, just I get curious about how that could potentially be done in more of a communal setting. But this feels like a good place to bookmark this conversation. There's so much more to talk about. I want to talk about next generation like so bad at
Yeah.
another time. But
Well,
thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing the stories and the perspectives. And it's both a kind of a fraught moment to be alive, but also exciting depending on your perspective and the filter of the goggles that you're wearing.
that's every time.
So that's every time. So thank you
Yeah,
so
this
much.
doesn't go
Yeah.
away. This was, when you had like Chinese scholars commenting on the idea that civilization was inevitable, but it was probably a bad idea, they
Mm-hmm.
felt the same. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
every year is like. Also, we had a heads up on this for a long time if anybody's studying this stuff, The main thing to do is, try to be silly and whimsical a bit. Learn about humor. It's a really good technology. Yeah, everything will happen as it happens.